Okay, I'm just going to go through this article from the Ottawa Citizen published on April 26th, 2024. And the article is entitled, CSIS Had Officer Investigated After She Reported a Superior Raped Her. Investigation concluded Jane Doe committed misconduct by using service equipment to conduct a romantic relationship with a colleague, and that's in quotations. So the article begins here. A CSIS officer's allegations that she was raped repeatedly by a superior and agency vehicle set off a harassment inquiry, but also triggered an investigation into her that concluded the alleged attacks were a quote-unquote misuse of agency vehicles by the woman. She is the same officer whose sexual assault allegations in a story by the Canadian press prompted public pledges of reform last year by David Vigneault, the director of Canadiansecurityintelligenceservice, and right now he is the former director. So, of course, he was replaced with psychopath Freemason Daniel Rogers, who's continuing the same activities now. So we'll continue on here. The officer said she was never told she was the subject of an investigation or that it concluded she committed misconduct by using service equipment to conduct what the investigators' report said was a quote-unquote romantic relationship with a colleague. The woman said she believed the investigation was reprisal for her rape complaint, and she only found out about the probe this year, 10 months after its conclusion, when she made an access to information request for her personal information held by the service. She said she, quote-unquote, absolutely was not in a consenting relationship with the other officer. The 5-page management report by an outside party which the officer provided to the Canadian press says they were retained by CSIS on November 18, 2021, to investigate allegations of misconduct against the woman. That was 8 days after she had formally complained to CSIS that she was raped 9 times by an officer decades older than her who had been assigned to mentor her on surveillance missions on her road coach. The woman cannot be named because of a law banning identification of covert officers, but she is called Jane Doe in a previous lawsuit against the government. The Canadian press first outlined her allegations last November. She and another surveillance officer in the CSIS British Columbia office said they were both sexually assaulted in service vehicles by the same senior officer while on missions between July 2019 and spring 2021. Jane Doe said that on one occasion, a mission failed because her coach broke off surveillance of a target to drive to a parking garage to rape her. This report is such an incredible violation, Jane Doe said, of the investigation into her. She called the management report the exact definition of a reprisal, which she told an investigator in 2022 was her fear when she delayed reporting the allegations. At the time, she said she believed she was being interviewed as part of an investigation into her alleged attacker, not herself. Jane Doe said her complaint was the only reason CSIS became aware of her own alleged misconduct. What would I have to gain from making up a fake complaint to draw attention to myself and all of the code of conduct things I apparently breached, she asked. It doesn't make any sense, so the fact that the report is allowed to even exist shows that I didn't have a fighting chance in hell, she said of her attempts to get justice for her complaint. Jane Doe said she was told by a federal labor relations officer that she was not informed about the report because she was on leave when it was handed down, and CSIS believed she should be focusing on her well-being. An email from the labor officer on Tuesday, which Jane Doe shared with the Canadian press, said the report was not intentionally hidden. Jane Doe is currently on long-term disability leave due to being diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. Asked about the investigation into the woman, CSIS spokesman Eric Balsam issued a statement saying, immediately upon hearing the allegations of inappropriate workplace behavior, CSIS launched a third-party investigation without delay. He said that in situations where harassment, discrimination, or misconduct had been found to have occurred, disciplinary action up to the termination of employment would be decided by a discipline committee. When asked to confirm that the rape complaint had herself been investigated, Balsam said the situation is complex and sensitive, and it would be inappropriate for CSIS to comment further on specific labor relations issues. Matt Maloney, an assistant law professor at Thompson Rivers University who handled hundreds of complaints as a workplace investigator, said Jane Doe's treatment was mind-boggling. Both Jane Doe and the other officer who said she was assaulted have previously said they did not feel they could go to police because the CSIS Act banned identifying themselves or their alleged attacker as covert officers, punishable by up to 5 years in prison. The women, who are both still employed by CSIS, said a flawed internal complaint process left victims vulnerable to retaliation. When the women's claims initially came to light last November, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau called them quote-unquote devastating and said his government was following up very directly. So it's interesting to note, I'm just interjecting here briefly, it's interesting to note that it would be punishable with up to 5 years in prison to simply identify themselves as covert officers with CSIS. So that's the type of system that they have in place where they have to keep really quiet about who they work for. And so that also helps them sweep things like this under the rug, and it also helps keep the employees completely quiet about the things that they're really involved in, which for the most part have absolutely nothing to do with national security and have to do with criminally harassing people for private interests. So we'll get back to the article here and continue on. Days after the story was published, Vigneault called a town hall meeting for the 3,000 plus CSIS staff about the woman's allegations that he said left him quote unquote deeply troubled. I'm sure it did. David Vigneault being a complete psychopath who obviously knew that these things were going on. But of course, once some of this stuff started to leak, they had to seize control of it with their controlled media, because ordinarily the Canadian media would not care about putting this out at all, but it seems likely that CSIS were worried that it could get out in other ways that they don't control, so they decided, okay, let's let some of it come out through the controlled media to try to minimize the damage and to try and create the illusion that we're actually doing something about it. Now, they did remove Vigneault, or he did step down, one of the two. They won't tell you the truth either way, so we don't know for sure what happened there. And then they replaced him with the current criminal Freemason psychopath Daniel Rogers, who is continuing the exact same activities. What's going on internally there, I don't know, but when I say continuing the exact same activities, I mean continuing to misuse all of these resources to criminally stalk and harass and terrorize people who have committed no crime, people who he perceives as being guilty of Orwellian wrongthink. So, okay, getting back to it here, he told staff the alleged rapist had left the service the day before the meeting and that he was ordering the quote-unquote urgent creation of Ombudsman's office to handle workplace problems without fear of reprisal. So again, anyone who could potentially go and report this sexual abuse was, they were in fear that there would be reprisals for reporting this. And this is exactly the same type of thing that one has to deal with if they file a report against the police for any wrongdoing in Ontario and all throughout Canada. There is always fear of reprisals. There will always be retaliation simply for speaking out against police corruption. And the same system is in place for CSIS, although there's a lot more secrecy going on to make sure that the people involved with CSIS keep their mouths shut completely about what they're really involved in. Vigneault also said the agency would release annual public reports on harassment and wrongdoing in the agency. There was no mention that Jane Doe had been put under investigation. And the outside investigator's final report into Jane Doe is dated April 12th, 2023. But she said she only found out about it this February. She said discovering the investigation made her nauseous. When she initially read the investigators that the investigators had retained to look into her conduct 8 days after her rape complaint, she thought it was a typo. So you understand what's going on here. She reports being raped on the job by another CSIS employee, her superior, and for that, they investigate her. And this is the sickness and the inversion that goes on with the mentality of these Freemasons who have been put into control positions in these organizations. And the irony of that is exactly what CSIS trains these agent provocateurs to do. They are to always cast blame on the people who they're harassing by trying to make up these ridiculous false reports that the people are mentally unstable, simply for documenting and showing what they're doing. And if they in any way try to expose the CSIS harassment, CSIS agents are given specific training with inversion, lying, and gaslighting to always cast blame on their victims. So the irony here that someone else who's involved with CSIS is dealing with the same thing can't be missed. And it's a very tragic situation and sad, but the irony can't be missed. I don't know if they have been investigating me basically since I submitted the complaint, or if this was a reaction to the investigation, she said. Regardless, I didn't know that they were doing it, even though it claims that I did. The misconduct report is heavily redacted, but it concludes Jane Doe breached the service's code of conduct due to inappropriate use of service equipment while on duty and withholding information from management regarding a romantic relationship with a colleague. It quotes her alleged attacker as saying he is sorry that a consensual relationship consulted in improper use of government redacted at the time. And time. The report says Jane Doe did not report the relationship, quote-unquote relationship, because really what it was him raping her, over fear of reprisals, quoting her as indicating that she was afraid of how it would affect my employment in the service, how it would affect my reputation, and my ability to continue working there, and I was not mentally and emotionally in a position to accept what had happened. So, of course, she was traumatized by this. To have somebody who's your superior at a job doing things like this, I mean, the instantaneous reaction should be to remove that psychopath from the position. But of course, as they do in other cases as well, CSIS did everything possible to protect the criminal psychopath, who I would suspect was probably a Freemason if he'd been moved up into an important supervisory position, and made sure that they tried to protect him while he was engaged in these criminal sexual abuse activities. Very, very disturbing and troubling. She said the quote-unquote evidence the report relied upon to conclude that the relationship was consensual, including the other officer's claims and pictures of the two together outside work, were lies. So him and I were in a group photograph together. Did that prove I wanted to have sex with him at work, she said? Maloney said that whether an employer's actions against a person who lodged a complaint could be considered retaliatory depended on many factors, including the time between the two actions or temporal proximity. Adverse actions following an employee complaint that come within a short time frame might suggest that there's a retaliatory motive on the part of the employer, he said. In this case, temporal proximity is a major factor because it's mere days. Maloney said it was standard practice to inform an employee if they were under investigation to let them respond. Jane Doe said she believed the service breached its own policy, failing to inform her. Maloney, who reviewed the CSIS breaches of conduct policy, said he was shocked by what he called a clear deviation from their own policy. But beyond that, it's a deviation from due process and fair procedure. Kind of like the deviation from due process that is also exhibited in what CSIS does to the subjects of their criminal harassment campaigns. But you won't hear anything about that in the Ottawa Citizen, will you? In that case, they're perfectly fine with covering these things up for CSIS, with the removal of due process for the people who they are terrorizing and criminally harassing, and having people stalk them and mob them at their jobs and having police follow them everywhere they go. Those people have no due process, and if they report any of these things to the police are told to cover these things up and make up some fake mental health lie and write false reports to cover up these crimes for CSIS. So there's no due process in that situation either. It's interesting how that is a recurring theme with this organization. Continuing on with the article. Beyond that, it's a deviation from due process and fair procedure. The service's policy says employees under investigation must be notified about the nature of the allegations against them, be given a chance to respond, be notified if they're found in breach, and be given a copy of the report. Jane Doe said none of that happened. I can't defend myself against something I don't know anything about, Jane Doe said. The BC Supreme Court dismissed Jane Doe's lawsuit against the federal government, claiming constructive dismissal and seeking damages in September 2023. It did not rule on her allegations, but found she hadn't exhausted CSIS internal complaint mechanisms. And how much do you want to make a bet that the judge on the BC Supreme Court who dismissed that was a Freemason? Because it's it's well known. You don't have to look too hard or dig too deeply to find out that the vast majority of prominent judges in Canada are Freemasons as well. That is well known, and they don't really even try to hide that. Just like within the police, all of the important positions are occupied by Freemasons, and we see them actively working to cover up things like this. She said she has now abandoned plans to appeal and is exploring CSIS formal grievance procedures. It's already been my life for over 2 years, and the damage that it's done to my mental health and my career obviously is now non-existent. And I don't see myself being able to get that back on track with this hanging over my head, she said. They just wear you down until you can't take it anymore. I'm sure I'm not the first, and I'm sure I won't be the last. It's interesting to note what she's saying here, because what she's saying as a CSIS employee is almost identical to what they do to the people who they're criminally harassing in this way as well. So you'd almost think that maybe one of their employees would reflect on that and look at what CSIS has done to them as an employee, and then maybe try to look at and empathize with some of the people. If they're doing that to their own employees, what do you think they're doing to these people who they're telling you to keep watch over? And are they being honest with you in any way about that when they're being so deceitful to cover up rapes and crimes like this? I mean, you would think that that would make some of the people who work there reconsider their loyalty to this organization, despite the good money that they're making to participate in these things. And maybe it has, I don't know. It's quite possible that it has. But certainly what's happened to this woman is horrendous, and it's not surprising at all the lengths that they went to try to silence her, and not surprising at all that the Freemason judge in the BC court dismissed her claims against the government as well, who are also very well aware that these things are happening. And so, and then of course after this they remove David Vigneault, or they claim he stepped down, or did they remove him? We don't know for sure. Again, they lie about so many things. And obviously, in the Canadian media, they work in coordination too. So one might ask the question then, well, if they work in coordination, why would the Canadian media allow this story to be brought out? And I think the answer to that is that CSIS was concerned about the story being brought out with people who they don't control anymore, being able to freely talk about it. Because let's be realistic, the details and what's really going on throughout that organization are probably far, far worse than what you're hearing here. So instead, they'll allow their controlled media sources to put the information out so that they can kind of minimize the damage and try to deceive the public into thinking that things are being done to stop these things from happening. In reality, you still see what CSIS are doing to me on a consistent basis as a law-abiding citizen, and simply as I just try to travel to and from work, they have people swarming around the area to do illegitimate surveillance on me. They send criminal biker gangs to stalk and harass me. They misuse police, firefighters, and paramedics, sending them to blare sirens whenever I go places and to stalk me. They send people around to continually follow me in retail establishments and to attempt to provoke altercations so that they can use these altercations to create more lies and slander against me, and to use for gaslighting to attempt to discredit the evidence that I've shown of CSIS, the Ottawa Police, the Gatineau Police, and the Toronto Police, as well as all these other public servants taking part in these criminal operations to harass and stalk law-abiding citizens. So should you be surprised that the same things are going on with this organization internally? I don't think you should. And again, we shouldn't be surprised at all that despite the fact that this is being put out in the controlled propaganda Canadian media through their outlets, don't think for 1 second that they're empathetic or that they want this exposed. It was just put out because CSIS told them it had to be put out, because they wanted to harness the information and present it in the way that would minimize the damage. And also to deceive the public into thinking that there's some type of oversight and that actions are being taken to prevent these things, when in fact none of that is happening. So this is the type of deceit, criminality, and corruption that is ever present within this organization. And it's important to note the similarities between what is done to employees within CSIS who come forward to report such things, such as rape allegations and crimes like that going on while they're at their jobs. You can see the distinct similarity between that and what they do to the people who they're subjecting to these criminal harassment campaigns. Immediately, as soon as she makes the complaint, immediately they start trying to reverse it and use inversion to cast blame on her without even looking into the complaint. Again, this is to cover up the things that they obviously know are going on, because they wouldn't react that way if they didn't already know that these things were going on. There wouldn't be an instinctive reaction to immediately try to blame the victim if they didn't already know that there was a lot of wrongdoing going on. That is only something that people who are guilty would do. So this is what the exact same thing that they tried to do to people who they are slandering and smearing to try to justify these criminal harassment campaigns. And there seems to be some type of a process. Again, I'm speculating on this. I don't know this for certain, but I think it's reasonable speculation to say that there's some sort of a process that they put these people through when they join CSIS to try to brainwash them into thinking that they're doing something good and that what they're doing is really in the best interest of public safety, when in fact that's complete nonsense. But there must be some sort of a process of deceit that goes on to try and convince the people who they're first bringing in that their actions are justifiable. And so I guess as you move up in the ranks, just as when you move up in the ranks with Freemasonry, you start to gain more knowledge of what really goes on. So I don't think right away the people who they first bring in, like these college students who they enlist, just to gain extra income, they might not know that drug trafficking is going on and that CSIS plays a role in that. But as you move up in the ranks, you start to gain more knowledge with regards to what really goes on. And it's also interesting to note, very important to note, that there is up to a 5-year prison sentence for any of these CSIS officers who even comes out and talks about things that they're involved in, because of course they're going to claim that, well, it's a breach of national security. So that's how they keep them quiet, completely quiet, about these crimes that they have them involved in. And of course, they're threatened with, the police if they say anything about the crimes that are going on, which runs right in with the whole order of the whole situation, because the police are also fully involved in these crimes. So they're going to insulate it all by threatening anyone who comes out and speaks about what they're involved in with prison time, and say that they're, breaching national security if they speak about these activities that the organization is involved in. So that's another way that they keep them completely quiet. And even people who may have some apprehensions and decide that they don't want to do this anymore, they also still have to be completely quiet about that. Otherwise, they'll be threatened with prison time. So they use these same methods to keep people quiet who they're committing crimes against. And obviously with these people who are given higher up statuses within these jobs as handlers and people who are supervisors, it's quite clear that a lot of them are involved in Freemasonry because they don't fear any repercussions for their actions, including raping their own employees, their own co-workers. They've been assured that that's going to be covered up. And so finally, even after, with all this scrutiny and with it coming out in the media, all that ends up happening to that guy is finally they terminate him from his job, but they won't press any charges against him for the rape, and he won't do any prison time. And I would be willing to bet, although I don't know for certain, but I would be willing to bet that that woman who has reported all these things is now still currently on a watch list and being targeted, because they're even telling you there how they went out of their way to attempt to slander her and discredit her, in the same way they go out of their way to attempt to slander and discredit people who speak out against the provable involvement of the police, of CSIS, and the RCMP with drug trafficking, and also with links to organized crime. Of course, people who are just starting out with CSIS are not going to be given all of that information But if they do their jobs well and are loyal and don't question anything and don't speak out against about the crimes that they're being involved in, then they'll move up and then they'll become privy to more information. So this is how this organized crime syndicate operates. And behind it all is the perpetual threat of arrest and of police intimidation if you speak out about any of it. And if you do, you also will find out that there are all of these Freemason judges within the judicial system who will simply throw the case out, despite even if you have overwhelming evidence, and regardless of what the situation is. So these are all important things to take into consideration when looking at this. And again, I don't believe that the Canadian media put this out with any good intentions. I believe they were forced to because CSIS were worried about it coming out and being promulgated in a manner that they could not control. So don't think for 1 second that these same media organizations that routinely cover up the crimes of the police and their involvement in drug trafficking are doing this out of the kindness of their hearts. They're simply doing what they've been instructed to do. And so that's all there is to that. And I think that you can look at this case and gain a lot of knowledge with regards to how these operations are really run.